In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 11, in which we go over contractionary fiscal policy, where in our last video we went over expansionary fiscal policy. In today's video, we seek to go over its counterpart by setting up some preliminaries in order to go over contractionary fiscal policy and conclude with some notes. Where in regards to our preliminaries, now that we've defined fiscal policy and examined the three tools available to the government, as well as examined how fiscal policy can be used to return to a long-run equilibrium given a short-run equilibrium that pertains to a contraction, we now seek to turn our attention in terms of how fiscal policy can be used to return to a long-run equilibrium given a short-run equilibrium that pertains to an expansion, where we will consider contractionary fiscal policy in regards to restoring that long-run equilibrium given a short-run equilibrium pertaining to an expansion. Where defining contractionary fiscal policy, this is going to be fiscal policy intended to restrain aggregate demand, or alternatively, fiscal restraint, that is, tax hikes or spending cuts intended to decrease aggregate demand. Or in regards to our three tools, this entails decreasing government purchases, increasing taxes, or decreasing income transfers, where the government has the option of using some combination of these three tools and these corresponding movements. So then with this information in terms of defining contractionary fiscal policy and how our three tools should move, let us proceed by example as we did with expansionary fiscal policy, where our setup will be, suppose that we have an aggregate product market that is currently in a long-run equilibrium, and the value of the MPC is known at a value of 0.5, and suppose that we have a positive AD shock in the form of an increase in firm expectations on sales. What we have going on with our ADAS model below is we are currently in a long-run equilibrium in which we add our potential output Y sub F and our targeted average price level P sub F, from which we have that positive AD shock, which alters firm expectations for the better, which means that this changes autonomous investments, where if there's an increase in autonomous investments, this then means there's an increase in investment. With an increase in investment, this then means there's an increase in aggregate demand. So we'll expect a rightward shift in aggregate demand from AD to AD1, holding the average price level fixed, from which there will be some adjustment towards the equilibrium at the intersection of AD1 and AS. But since we are taking the stance that business cycles are not stable, then this change to investment through autonomous investment from the AD shock makes its way through the circular flow, where after an N amount of cycles, we'll see a secondary shift in AD due to an increase in consumption. So holding the average price level fixed, we'll go from AD1 to AD2, where after this change occurs, then we'll have adjustment to the short-run equilibrium at the intersection of AD2 and AS, giving us a real output level Y star 1 at the average price level P star, where we observe that Y star 1 is strictly greater than our potential output level Y sub F, so unemployment will not be a concern. But what we see though is that P star is strictly greater than our targeted average price level P sub F, so inflation will be a concern. So the difference between Y star 1 and Y sub F will give us our inflationary gap, given that we have an increase in the average price level. Therefore, at this short-run equilibrium, the government must then use contractionary fiscal policy to restrain aggregate demand, such that after the cumulative change of the policy and the multiplier effect has been considered, we adjust to our long-run equilibrium back at potential output and our targeted average price level. Where, to do this, if the government were to solely consider the inflationary gap and try to target this as the cumulative change in terms of contractionary fiscal policy, after the policy tool and the multiplier effect has kicked in, by targeting the inflationary gap, after adjustment, what we would see is the aggregate product market would adjust to a short-run equilibrium, somewhere in between the long-run equilibrium and our current short-run equilibrium, in which there would still be an inflationary gap as well as inflation occurring. So what must be done is that the government must restrain aggregate demand by more than the inflationary gap, or in this case, this is going to be the difference between Y sub 3 and Y sub 1, in which we'll designate this as the 80 excess, where by targeting the 80 excess, by restraining aggregate demand by this amount, after the policy tool has kicked in, as well as the multiplier effect has been considered, when the aggregate product market begins adjusting, it will adjust to precisely that of the long-run equilibrium, in which we restore our potential output as well as our targeted average price level. And then to put some numerics in terms of our model now, which will aid us in terms of our calculation section, let us consider that the potential real output level is at a value of 10, and our targeted average price level is 5. So our long-run equilibrium, real output level 10, targeted average price level 5. Our short-run equilibrium has a real output level of 12 and an average price level of 7, in which we see the inflationary gap is the difference between 12 and 10, or positive value of 2, and the difference between inflation at the difference between the average price level at the short-run equilibrium and the long-run equilibrium is 7 minus 5, giving us a value of 2. And we see that the 80 excess is going to be the difference between this value of 8 and our real output level at the short-run equilibrium of 12, or that aggregate demand must decrease by a total value of 4. So then to recap, what we saw was that the short-run equilibrium after the shock at Y star 1 and P star was a real output level of 12 at an average price level of 7, where the inflationary gap was the difference between Y star 1 and potential output, or 12 minus 10, giving us a positive value of 2. This leads us to indicate that demand pull inflation has occurred, which we can also see is evident given that we have inflation given the difference between P star and P sub F, or 7 minus 5, giving us a value of 2, or an increase in the average price level, where in order to restore the long-run equilibrium, aggregate demand must fall by the difference between Y star of 3 and Y star 1, which was 12 minus 8, or that aggregate demand must fall by 4, which is precisely the value of the 80 excess, which we now define as the amount of aggregate demand that must be reduced in order to achieve full employment after allowing for price level changes. Where once again, if the government were to only change aggregate demand by the amount of the inflationary gap, that is the value of 2, then the aggregate product market, after the policy change and the multiplier effect has kicked in, would adjust to a short-run equilibrium in which there is inflation and there would still be an inflationary gap as a result. So then, with all this in mind then, we know that in regards to our tools, the government can use some combination of decreasing government purchases, increased taxes, or decrease income transfers. In regards to our target, we know that the government must alter aggregate demand overall by the 80 excess, which has a value of 4. And using our formulas that we looked at in our prior video for the 80 shortfall, but now applying it for the 80 excess, we know that the cumulative change to government purchases can be calculated as the 80 excess divided by the multiplier. In regards to taxes, it's going to be the 80 excess divided by the MPC scaled by the multiplier. And in regards to income transfers, modeled similarly to taxes, it's going to be the 80 excess divided by the MPC scaled by the multiplier. So then, overall as well, what we saw with expansionary fiscal policy translating to what we saw with the formulas as well, in regards to our initial changes, government spending can lead to a one-for-one change in aggregate demand, given that the government is directly purchasing goods and services in the product market through defense spending, healthcare spending, and infrastructure spending, and etc. Whereas in regards to tax changes and income transfer changes, we will expect a less than one-for-one change, given that the government is altering consumer income in one way or another, such that consumers have the ability to consume or save. Therefore, only a fraction of that change will make its way through a change in consumption. And lastly, that income transfers and taxes can be modeled analogously in terms of their cumulative change. So then, with this in mind, let us now solve numerically for our tools given the 80 excess value of 4, our marginal propensity to consume value of 0.5, and our multiplier value of 2, that is 1 divided by 1 minus 0.5, or our MPS, which is 0.5 as well, so 1 divided by 0.5, giving us that value of 2. Beginning with government purchases, our AD excess has a value of 4, our multiplier has a value of 2. Dividing the two, we see that government purchases must decrease by 2. So our initial change to government spending is going to be a value of 2, such that the cumulative change to aggregate demand is going to be a value of 4, where taking the difference between our cumulative change and our initial change, we get our change in consumption, where the sum of the change in consumption and government spending gives us our overall decline of 4 as needed. Moving on to taxes, our tax formula is the AD excess, which is 4, divided by the MPC value of 0.5, scaled by the multiplier value of 2, which gives us an overall change in taxes must increase by a value of 4, which we see is strictly larger than what we saw with government purchases, as expected, given that we need a larger tax change in order to get the same effect as government purchases. Where with this initial increase in taxes by 4, after it makes its way to consumer income and there's the change between consumption and savings, consumption will change by a value of 2, where overall our cumulative change to aggregate demand will be a reduction of aggregate demand by 4. We're taking the difference between our change in aggregate demand and our change in initial consumption from the tax change will give us a value of 2, and summing the two changes in consumption will get a value of 4. Now, proceeding on to income transfers, which is analogously modeled to taxes, this is going to be the AD excess divided by the MPC scaled by the multiplier, or 4 divided by 0.5 scaled by 2, giving us a value that income transfers must lead to income must decline by a total value of 4, which we see is identical to our tax change, which we also see is larger than our government purchase change, given that consumers can consume or save, so only a fraction of it will see its way through consumption changes. So income declines by 4. Consumers then reduce their consumption by 2, given that the MPC value is 0.5, such that our cumulative change to aggregate demand is minus 4 as needed, such that taking the difference between aggregate demand, its cumulative change, and our initial change to consumption, we'll see that our additional change in consumption will be minus 2. Summing these two consumption effects, we get back minus 4 as needed. So then, working through these three policy tools numerically, let us now graphically model this response by considering the change in taxes or the change in income transfers, where here we have our ADAS model, where we are at the intersection of AD2 and AS, real output level 12, average price level 7. This is a short-run equilibrium, given that potential output is 10 and our targeted average price level is 5. So here we have that increase in taxes or that decrease in income transfers, such that after this occurs, we'll have a leftward shift in aggregate demand going from 82 to 83, holding the average price level fixed, in which we have a decline in consumption initially by 2. We'll have some initial adjustment to this equilibrium state at the intersection of AD3 and AS, but after this change makes its way through the circular flow, we'll expect a secondary shift in consumption, in which we'll have a secondary shift in aggregate demand as a result, going from 83 to 84, where holding the average price level fixed, we have an additional decline in consumption by a value of 2. So our initial change in consumption was 2, secondary change in consumption was also 2, so our AD excess value of 4 has been achieved, such that after adjustment, we will then have movement down the AD4 curve until we intersect AS at our equilibrium at a real output level of 10, at an average price level of 5, which corresponds to a long-run equilibrium since our goal of full employment is met. Where overall what we saw was by increasing taxes or decreasing income transfers, we were able to restrain aggregate demand by the AD excess such that we could restore the long-run equilibrium, completing our narrative on expansionary cycles. So with that in mind, in regards to fiscal policy, some notes are it takes time to recognize if an expansion or contraction is occurring, as well as time to develop and implement fiscal policy. And in regards to the AD excess and shortfall, it is non-trivial in terms of calculating and finding its value.